Okay, so first of all, I want to welcome everybody that showed up today. We're super excited to have this particular kind of topic, or topics, I should say, in a panel discussion. And the biggest thing we want you to understand from all the different panelists is, how did this webinar develop? And yes, like any webinar, it was part of an AECT group, and they said we could do it, and here we are. However, we were really, really passionate about this idea that we need critical theories. So the whole thing is, how did we decide to come up with like critical theories and why we need them? And I think it comes from, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but this personal passion of ours where we've all had an experience or lack thereof in which barriers have been encountered in educational practice or research. From a personal perspective, I've been told I can't research things because they're gender related, or I shouldn't because it doesn't look right, or I might offend people. And I think we've all had those different situations, some blatantly, some kind of off-sided. And we realize that the reason we're getting these is because academic research and practice falls into routine. And I love Berger and Lechman, 1966. It's because that's the way it's always been. So we get into these research routines, and certain topics and areas and agendas are the way it's always been. So we follow those in our theoretical frameworks. So what we do is we push against those, and that's why we get a little bit of pushback. So we've decided that because those critical theories push against the constructions or the way it's been, we're often seen as disruptive. Not necessarily bad, but just a little disruptive. It's because this is the mainstream way that people have been thinking and researching. But we firmly believe as a panel that in our present political, economic, and social climate, which affects education, whether we want to say that or not, these are the theories we absolutely need in order to deconstruct what's happening and better understand learning, because I think that's an integral part of who we are as instructional designers. So, and then I guess it's going right to me, isn't it, Katie? Okay, so I'm going to share my presentation. So 1 second here. And then we'll go from panelist to panelist. We're each going to talk probably about, I have about 5 to 10 minutes. That's what we kind of put it at, and we'll go from there. So, screen. Here is, okay. My computer decides to be slow, like the one time. Can everybody see that? Awesome. Okay. So my name is Rebecca Clark-Stahlkamp. I am a second-year PhD candidate at Virginia Tech, and I guess my secret is my past experience is not just in history, as most of you will know. It's actually in gender history. That was my focus, critical sociology and gender studies. So that is where my training lies. And I somewhat hide it because I'm somewhat seen as disruptive in the way I think and the way I deconstruct things. And that led me to kind of start my presentation on feminism, or feminist theory, on why are we so afraid of the F word? And I don't mean the F word as in the F word, I mean feminism. In my experience over the last probably 15 years, I'll approach people, and I don't go around asking people if they're feminists, don't worry. But when I have a chance to talk to someone and ask, are you a feminist? I instantly see their back get up, and it's this almost immediate rejection. I'm not a feminist, but I believe in women's rights. Or I'm not a feminist. No, I'm not a feminist at all, but like, women should have economic dependence. So it's a lot of pushback. And I think it comes from misconceptions that we have in society and what feminism is, which leads me to the next question, which is, what exactly is feminism? So this is actually a very loaded question. And I sat for the last couple of weeks trying to really parse this down to something simplistic. And what I want you to understand is I'm going to give you a very simple definition just to introduce it. There's much more to it, and you can unpack it from there. Going ahead, my screen. There we go. We need to first delineate between feminism and feminist theory. So the big difference between these two is feminism is actually a movement advocating social, political, economic equality for all genders. And then feminist theory is actually taking a particular lens, and it's used to critically question or engage, or as I use the word deconstruct, you'll hear a lot, those social, political, and economic structures. So very different words, both part of the feminist kind of culture, if you want to put it that way. those are good things to me. So I always think like that's a really great starting point for feminism, but why are we still hesitant about it? So why is there still this hesitancy to embrace that? And I think it comes from this idea of radicalism. It's both historical, it's something that's attached to feminism, and we want to disassociate ourselves from it. But I always think it's funny, this is my favorite quote, feminism is the radical notion that women are people. And that's essentially it. This is how it started, this idea that women are people, they deserve a place in society. Because of that belief, though, the radical connotation has happened historically. So I'm going to do a very quick, promise it's quick history lesson. We're going to move through the feminist movement and explain how radicalism has kind of been attached to it. And that's where it kind of is stuck. So it comes from the first wave feminist movement, which was the end of the 1800s. So at that time, there's this, and this is in the US, maybe England specifically, so I apologize, it is a very one view based on our current context. It comes from this idea that we had the cult of womanhood. So it was these very encultured, ingrained ideas that women had a place in society. It was in the home and it was to be quiet. They had no power, and men's sphere was in the public realm. So women started to push against this. This is the suffragette movement at the end of the 1800s. You see women pushing against it, and they were deemed as radicals, and they actually were, in some extent, seen as medically insane. So they were, some women were actually discounted in society, called out, and actually put in insane asylums. So it was a very extreme reaction to it because they're moving against the way it's always been. We move, and I'm going to jump many years to the 1960s, which is the second wave feminist movement. And we see society break apart to look at feminism from different perspectives. So we have, the Black Panthers, we have different women of different groups fighting for different rights, different agendas. And at the same time, we have this threat of communism. So they automatically get branded as radicals, communists, usually as a scapegoat. Bra burners, which is actually a myth that never happened. So we have all these like ideas around women pushing against the way it's been, asking for reproductive rights and things like that, and they're radicals. So a lot of times we disassociate ourselves from them. It still happens today. I'm not saying this is historical. It still happens in certain instances today. If we look at Roe versus Wade and those kind of political things that are going on right now. The biggest thing that you see the theme across this historically and currently is that we're always pushing against the way it has always been. So this idea of power. So this brings in one of those terms. This is a very difficult term to wrap your head around. There's a lot of dynamics with it. I always say the simplest way, this is how I was taught in my intro week of women's studies, is the way it's always been is patriarchy for feminists. So it's a system of society or government. And this is where men hold power and women are systematically excluded. That's expanded now. It's not just the dichotomy of women and men, various genders, various groups, which brings me back to our definition of feminism and where I had highlighted equality. So we need to understand that feminism has not always been for everyone. So various groups and labels cede or deny access based on their goals and their agendas. This is historically and currently. So that word equality is defined by different groups, and it's defined differently by those groups based on those goals. So you'll see very broad different views on what feminism is based on what they want and how they're going to get it and how they theoretically view the theory that kind of pushes behind that. So that brings me to just kind of my own, I love a good alliteration, feminist flavors. There's a lot of them. So I went through everything I could find, and I parsed the internet, my own women's studies. Yes, I keep everything, women's studies coursework and stuff like that. And I try to find as many types of feminism to give you a kind of look. I made a word cloud, and this is by no means an extensive list. There's tons more. So in my search, I actually discovered something new. There's a vegetarian feminist. I had no idea. So there's been a lot of progress and change over the time that, since I've studied it. But this is just a small section of what's out there. And keep in mind that these all intersect in different ways. So there are Christian pro-life feminists. I'm an intersectional postmodernist. So there's lots of different dynamics going on here. And to keep in, to kind of get a look at it, like how one person can factor into this from their own personal view. I'm going to use myself so that we don't call anybody out or there's no personal labeling. But so I'm an intersectional feminist. I'm also a postmodernist. So that's me in the center. And and I'm not going to get too far into this because I know we're going to talk about it in a further presentation, but intersectionality for me, as defined by Crenshaw, we'll leave that to the next presentation, is looking at all different aspects of my identity. So I'm not just a woman, which is what usually is what we look at. I also have an age, I have ability or disability, sexuality, my education, a race, a class, language, culture, ethnicity. There's many more, but these are some of the big components that either give me access and privilege or deny me access and privilege. So we need to keep those kinds of levels of intersectionality kind of straight when you look at different groups of people, because depending on race, class, gender, language, culture, all these different things, there are oppressed or have privileges. So it's not fluid just because you're a woman, you're oppressed. There's different types of women, there's different groups of women. So just keep that in mind going forward, because I think it'll help kind of frame what we're all talking about.
You got 2 minutes, Rebecca.
I'm just about to wrap her up. Thank you. So what does this have to do with instructional design and technology was my next question. And it's kind of funny because I get asked that when I do say I come from a feminist perspective when I'm looking at instructional design. Try saying that in an engineering department. It's very interesting feedback you get for it. And why is feminist theory something we need now in our actual field? So my view on this, so again, it's my personal view, is that this patriarchal oppression, or the way that it's always been, translates to technology and design. We need to keep in mind that technology is not neutral. I know Kay loves saying that. And design is not neutral either. And this is just some examples going forward. I'm going to leave you with this. So we have personal experience of instructional designers. There's Patty Campbell. Romero Hall and colleagues detailed their experiences in an article. Donaldson does an entire book on women's experiences in ID. They all experience barriers and access privileges in our field. Then the biggest thing is actually in our design choices, so instructional design material choices, the decisions we make when we're designing. We all design from a particular lens. So how are we alienating various groups in our designs? When we say we're learner-centered, like, are we? And who do we view as the learner? Personal experience is I come from a very conservative background. I've had to change the way I think. So when I was looking at who the learner was, I'd often see a white woman sitting there in my head. And I realized that I wasn't doing that on purpose, but I am alienated groups of people because that is the archetype that I use to design with. And a lot of us don't realize that. So those are just some things to keep in mind. I'm going to leave you with this, and if you choose, here's my plug. If you choose to come to my side in the breakout rooms, we're going to look at how does feminist theory play into your own practice and research. Maybe you don't think it does, and that's okay. We're going to talk about it. So, okay, and thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca. All right, so like I said before, but for those of you who just joined us, we've got 5 different presentations, and then we are going to try to have some space for discussion. So we're just going to kind of move through everybody's presentations, and so just make a note of any questions or ideas that brings up, and you can bring it up in your breakout rooms. So Lily, you've got the stage next.
Great, let me try to share my slides. Try to, is it like already like a full screen view? Okay, great. Hi, oh, sorry. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second presentation today. For my presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about how thinking about particularly like culture and learning critically, and how that impact my work and myself as a graduate student. So my name is Lily Yan. I am a PhD candidate from the Department of Instructional Technology and Learning Sciences, Utah State University. So this is a very typical beginning of self-introduction as a doctoral student, but I also want to talk culturally about myself. So culturally, I am Han Chinese from the southeastern Wu region of China. It is an area of rich Asian culture and as well as modern vibes. And as an international student, I come to USU for my doctoral education on the ancestral land that have been carefully stewarded by federally and non-federally recognized tribes, including Gushoot, Navajo, Shoshone, Paiute, Ute, and Ute Mountain Ute. So really just comparing the 2 ways I've introduced myself, I kind of realized my cultural identity as well as cultural experience show a really important part of my personality when it comes to thinking about the learning environment. So for me, I think the learning environment is not a neutral space. There are several theories and ideas that really support my exploration regarding learning environment. One of the really important ideas that impact me the most is the set of expectations. Set of expectations is a set of assumptions, privileges, and benefits that accompany the status of being white. It is often embedded in our social structure, and people may not always be aware that how often set of expectations, as well as the representation, will kind of shape how we think about the environment and how we design the environment. So set of expectations seem natural and objective rather than socially and ideologically constructed, and they prescribe acceptable meanings and meaning-making practices. As Ben and her colleague have argued, set of expectation, like the term, is really helpful to articulate and problematize entrenched, usually hidden boundaries that tend to control the borders of acceptable meanings and meaning-making practices. So for me, I think the term set of expectations is really helpful to articulate privilege, a privileged way of knowing. So by thinking about the set of expectation, I become more aware that learning and teaching are both cultural, historical, and political. So as a graduate student, I began to wonder, like, as we are designing a learning environment for the students, how can we better articulate culture in the learning environment? And oftentimes when we design a learning environment, culture is not at a central place. So I'm also thinking about how when we design something, can we center culture in a helpful way? There are several previous studies that really just contribute different ways to center culture in learning. Probably some of these you have already heard about, or read about, or even work with. There are several, I will just go through the list real quick, like culturally relevant, culturally responsive, culturally sustaining, culturally revitalizing, culturally situated, and culturally disruptive. So for me, as a graduate student, I feel like these are really helpful ways for us to think about how we connect culture to the learners and really reflect about the environment, learning environment, is it neutral or not? So I feel like it's a really helpful way for me to understand how to make culture visible. And these are really important pillars in my work. And today I'm just going to give an overview of one of the theories and an approach that is culturally disruptive pedagogy. I will just give a very quick overview and we can talk more in the breakout room. So culturally disruptive pedagogy take culture as really as a dynamic process rather than static image. The view of seeing culture in kind of like the process and making really gives space to dismantle the Western paradigm in the way of creating ruptures in schooling, the social system that counters the normalizing of whiteness. And culture disruptive pedagogy create a secret choose spaces and the zone of contact where multiple choose, new knowledge and new identity can take hold. In St. Patrick's article, the one is also in our reference list, highlighted three key tenets of cultural disruptive pedagogy: tensions, disruption, and self-discovery. I will talk a little bit about one project I'm working on about cultural disruptive pedagogy, and we can see how that impacts the design. So one of the projects that I've been working on as a graduate assistant is called Cultivate Connections. So in this project, we design and implement culture-centered curriculum units for sixth grade students from a public charter elementary school. The key aim of the project is to cultivate connections across partner, culture, and discipline. And the project is funded by Spencer Foundation and several smaller funds from USU as well. Here we develop, in this project, we develop a research practice partnership with a team of Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers, educators, and designers. And we are particularly working with the two teachers, Stu and Jen, from the Edith Bone Lab School in Logan, Utah. The two teachers, they co-teach the sixth grade. Stu focused on social studies and language art, and Jen is their science and math teacher. So like the kind of collaboration is trying to disrupt the pragmatic division of discipline in some ways. In the past 2 years, we have been working with Stu and Jen to co-design a serious curriculum activity for the kids. One of the most important part is their field trip to the San Juan River area. It's more like southern part of Utah, but our school is kind of up north. The goal is to center culture by connecting the field trip experience with what the students will learn in the rest of their school year. So they usually went on a trip sometime in September or October. So they were going to connect the experience to what they're going to learn in the rest of the school year. And one of the important things of being there is like understand the culture on the land as well as meet the curriculum goals. So in this way, we do think a lot about what does culture mean in this way, and what part of knowledge is not usually represented in the curriculum. So in this co-design process, especially with the two teachers, we did go through several stages of tension, disruption, and self-discovery, which lead to innovations. So for us, everyone in the team think critically about culture, and this output is really to make some innovation about redesign curriculum activities. Here are some quotes I got from the team. So this one is from their teacher, Stu. He said, I think a lot of times we don't recognize where we are culturally in terms of our surroundings. So it was really helpful for me to look at myself as culture being and see where I come from, to be able to notice others comes from different places. And there's another one from Devon. She is another graduate student on the project, and she is an Indigenous student. She said, I feel valued as a collaborator, and this could sometimes be surprising and confusing because it's counter to what I had experienced in other spaces. It took me a while to settle in, but once there, I felt immense validation. The last one is from myself. So for me, while working on this project, I feel valued not only as a student investigator, but also as a person who brings cultural perspectives, stories, and experience to the team. So here I focus more on, really more on the adults, like the teachers and investigators, but like in our project, we also really want to understand students as a culture being. So to be able to better move forward to really make meaningful innovation that impact their learning as well as ourselves. So this is pretty much what I have for today. And I do want to put a link to a full article that the team have written about culturally disruptive pedagogy like with the two teachers. And I would just want to open up for questions when we move on with this webinar today. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Lily. So again, if you have questions for Lily, just take note of them and we will be in a breakout session to discuss them further. I'm actually next as presenting, if one of my co-presenters wouldn't mind giving me a time.
I got you, Katie.
Thank you. All right. Oop, wrong one. All right, so yeah, I'm Katie Walters. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of this webinar. I'm at the University of Georgia, and I'm going to talk today about multimodal approaches and what they can open up for our teaching and our research and our design. And I'm going to focus particularly around issues of power, agency, and access. Oops. And so a lot of times the word multimodal can be exchanged for the word multimedia. And that's just like indicating that there's more than one mode or media being used. So like in this presentation, I'm already gesturing, I'm using image, text, and sound. But when I'm talking about multimodality, I'm talking about something a little bit more than that. So multimodality is a whole domain of inquiry. And it's scholarship that's rooted in what's called the multimodal turn. And so this is the idea that there's big changes afoot, and this was written in 1996, but it's still applicable today, that impact the context in which we teach and learn. And so the two big changes are increasing linguistic and cultural diversity in our societies, and just there's so many different ways of communication that can happen now due to technology. And so these together produce ways of communicating that go well beyond language. So if we restrict ourselves to either calling literacy language literacy, or only teaching and assessing based on language or text, then we're really limiting what we're understanding about our students or our learners. And so a multimodal perspective does look at text and language. It looks at what we talk and how we write, but it also looks at how we navigate either digital spaces or physical spaces. It looks at how we draw, what we decide to interact with, and how. So there's a lot of different aspects to it, moving beyond language. And then it takes all of those different interactions between different modes and places them in a context. So multimodality considers the interactions between all those modes that I just said. They're happening within a particular socially, cultural, historical context to produce a particular meaning. And then they're kind of reimagined and pulled back into our conversation. So there is this kind of dual focus in multimodality. First on the sociocultural historical context, and then second on the communication potentials of technology. And so what this kind of starts to open up then is, well, what is learning and how should knowledge be represented? Or what are potentials ways for knowledge to be represented that maybe go beyond a traditional idea of what it should look like? And so because it kind of teases those ideas out, really issues of power, agency, and access emerge from this. And so it's power in terms of whose knowledge is valid and the role that institutions like schools have in either producing or reproducing or even reimagining those values. It's agency in terms of who gets to learn and how they get to learn, whose voices are heard, and what roles are available to what people, particularly within institutions. And then access is kind of the, what do we do about it? So access is who gets to learn and how they get to learn the communication skills that we need to be able to really negotiate all of that linguistic and cultural complexity that exists in our society today and the digital and communication needs. So a multimodal approach, it impacts everything from the content that you're working with, the design, the implementation, and the assessment of learning. And so a lot of time, the way that this approach is engaged in the classroom is having students either create like an arts-based project or like digital storytelling, where then as the researcher, you're taking the student's product, the cultural and social and political context in which it is produced, and then the meta language that the students develop to be able to describe their design choices. So again, that's the access piece. Can students construct and deconstruct these messages? And all of that gets analyzed to understand the students' meaning-making process. And so that probably feels like a lot of information and kind of abstract right now. So I'm just going to briefly talk through an example. So you can see the pictures here. This is from D. Janes and Kermie Hall. So this is not research that I personally did, but I really like this study. It looks at how high school students researched media representation of women of color, and then they were tasked with creating an arts-based representation of their findings to share with their classmates. And so there was a lot of data collected. So the thing is that when you're doing a multimodal project, if you want to account for that really rich context, social, cultural, and historical aspects, you want to account for how students are interacting with each other, how they're navigating their group work, their classroom, what they're focusing on, what they're thinking about. You want to look at observations, you want to collect interviews, and then the artifacts themselves. So the lesson plans that you're using, as well as the products that the students are actually creating. And so for this study, this was the final product that the students created. And so you can see if you're looking at this, and with a traditional methodology, it would be pretty difficult to analyze kind of what is going on here. There's a lot of different things going on. So I'm just going to briefly talk through how you would approach this multimodally. So we're just going to look at one image here. And the student is using linguistic and visual modes of communication. And then audio would be if she was engaged in conversation, kind of explaining her choices here. And I don't think that any of these modes of communication are like new to us as a field. Like these are things that we all consider when we're creating lessons and presentations and things. But what I do think the multimodal perspective kind of opens up here is the focus on the way the student is engaging in their own construction of meaning. So the focus isn't anymore about like, what is the most effective way to put together a message, but why did this student make these choices? And what can that tell us about her understanding, her perspective, her context? And so just looking at this picture, you want to think like, what is this student trying to communicate? How are they communicating it? So what cultural, what linguistic resources are they pulling from? And then the critical side would be, how are these aligning or pushing back with dominant narratives? And then very important to the multimodal approach is that it's not just this set of text and this image and this audio and this gesture, but it's all of them working together to produce a meaning. And so it's the interaction between these, which is called intersemiotics. And so here's another slide. This is just another like zoom in on part of their poster. And so this student is describing herself as a Latina. She's both embracing and rejecting what she says are, stereotypes of both her culture and her gender. So we're going to get into intersectionality again later. But here she is, she's juxtaposing a photograph of herself in what she describes as a media typical representation of a Latina woman. And then she's also got pictures of herself in like Disney outfits and hanging out with superheroes and what she says is being a nerd. And so she's pulling together these different resources available to her to construct an image of herself that is rejecting, but also engaging with and embracing these different resources. And so when we're looking at this in this context, you can kind of see what's important and meaningful to her as a student, rather than like me as her teacher or me as a lesson designer wanting her to get something specific out of a lesson. So the assessment is really changed quite a bit when you're looking at this from a multimodal perspective.
Just less than a minute there, Katie.
Sorry. Oh no, I wanted to talk
I did a visual 2 minutes. I apologize. I realized you couldn't see me.
No, that's okay. It's a hard topic to cover, and all of these are hard topics to cover in a short amount of time. I would just say that agency and power in this study, the students got to tell their own stories. They were in positions as the knowers, as the experts. And the context of the school is that all of the teachers were white and all of the administrators were white, while the students were linguistically and culturally diverse. So having the students kind of take over the hallways and kind of reclaim some of that conversation back in that context was particularly powerful. And those types of insights are what you get with a multimodal approach. And yeah, we'll talk more about that in our breakout groups. Oh, and Kay and Paula are next.
Hi, everybody. Let me share my screen real quick. Okay, can everybody see it? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Okay, I guess Paula and I should introduce ourselves. Paula, do you want to introduce yourself first, or do you want me to? We didn't cover that yesterday.
Good day, everyone. I'm a second-year student at Indiana University. Okay.
Okay, Kay Novak. I am a doctoral student at the University of Colorado, Denver. And And our presentation is going to be might be a little bit different because we kind of want to hit you over the head with the terms. And we want you to leave knowing these terms and going, oh yeah, I remember that. I can I can go back and I can go ahead and look at those references. And so you'll see some of that. So hopefully while we've been talking, you've been reading that. And Rebecca already alluded to, I'm always going around like my mantra, educational technology is not neutral. and saying things like that. And it's just been my experience as an instructional designer and educational technologist that you show people a technology and then you keep talking about it and keep talking about it. And 3 or 4 years later, there will be an instructor or professor who'll decide to use it. And then they'll start a buzz and things get going. So, you know, that's the hope of it. So for this slide, just introducing the critical race theory. Have you guys heard the term critical race theory, you know, somewhere recently, anywhere? You can go ahead and type where you might have heard that in the chat if you would like to go ahead and do that, because we're hearing a lot of it and I'm not allowed to, I'm not allowed to comment. Yes, you are, okay? I'll say, TJ, you are. But that is something that people are feeling. So even though it says at the end of this, we'll go beyond a discussion of multiculturalism and white racial epiphanies. No, we're going to talk about white racial epiphanies. So we'll go ahead and get started.
Good. So the first term that we would like to discuss is colorblind racism. The definition is up there, but it refers to racial attitudes or beliefs that race should not and does not matter. Now, in the context of one of the articles that we're going to share with you by Matthias and Leo, in the urban classroom setting where this is mostly experienced, it happens when Caucasian teachers feel uncomfortable to engage in the dynamics of the classroom. So they consider themselves to be a messiah, and they view urban schools as deficit, which they probably are in terms of how they are staffed for resources and zoning. But that way of looking at things is more of a deficit perspective and not a strength perspective. And the authors of the article discuss about the resilience of students and their culture. And it also looks at, in terms of this colorblindness racism perspective, that the teachers, urban teachers, probably when they were doing their teacher training, they do things methodologically, like looking at the rubrics. So how am I going to teach a lesson that just integrates culture? But it was nothing meaningful. They don't think about the meaningful conversations that they should be having to actually have effective change or to have people students thinking critically and differently about themselves. Another issue that was raised with respect to colorblind racism is something that I can relate to because I consider myself to have Black privilege as I am not someone from the United States. So you couldn't fall to a victim of that. They said that, let's say teachers, they were college educated, so they experience upward mobility. So they may be divorced from the problems that their students are really experiencing. And that could cause a problem and self-perpetuate the cycle. Another thing about colorblind racism is again, in the training of teachers, that you really should have specialized training on this whole issue of critical pedagogy and all the 5 terms, culturally responsive, etc. That was introduced by Lily. And there is a political perspective. Someone commented that they can't talk about it. And we'll come back to that in another one of the definitions. So anything you want to share with us, Kay, about this? So what did I
okay, so the quick thing that I was going to say, as a white woman, what ends up happening in what I have done is, with my students, I'm like, I love all my students. I don't care what color they are. I don't care what creed. I don't care what religion, but it blocks actually interrogating what is happening with the students. The I'm going to love them all the same, that in education, that is part of going into colorblind racism. And my quick little thing that I'm going to say was, when I was teaching in a southeastern college in Colorado, it was a community college. I knew my students who were Black, who had names like Tashawn and JV, when they drove from that little, the little rural area to Denver or Kansas City during the weekend, they had to worry about a different kind of driving experience than my students who had names like Brandon and Michael and who were white male students. That there was a difference in that drive. And I knew that in 2005, but I wasn't voicing things like that kind of difference. So even though that we can say we love our students, or we're just looking out for our students, going back to that almost savior mentality, that you can be demonstrating colorblind racism, and this exudes into our instructional design models when we don't examine them. So yes, thank you, Paula. I will go on to the next slide. Go ahead.
Critical whiteness is the second term we want you to get comfortable being uncomfortable with. It examines the meaning of white privilege and white privilege pedagogy, as well as how white privilege is connected to complicity in racism. Now, if you think about what we're really doing here as instructional designers or as teachers, we have a curriculum. The curriculum itself actually reinforces the hegemonic whiteness, and it recycles the dominant rhetoric that is presumed to be right. So if we repeat it, teaching it wholeheartedly, regurgitating it, you're really perpetuating the status quo. We need to be, as individuals, as teachers, we need to confront our own feelings of discomfort talking about race. If you, let's say as an instructional designer, you can talk to your SMEs, me, and have them feel uncomfortable talking about it, it can change how they approach even their activities in the classroom. So what the authors Matthias and Leo went into, they spoke about critical race metacognition. I thought that was a very strong word. It's about metacognition. So this is now about cognitively thinking and reflecting on the presuppositions and the historical constructions of race. So everything we take for granted, media, written, verbal, we need to question it. And one of the practical ways that was discussed in the article of doing it is that you can separate your learning objectives. So yes, you have, in the US context, Common Core, you have your learning objectives that you must teach, but you can separate it as well and have your critical learning objectives. So having those, and if you're thinking about perhaps a Socratic approach, if it's a more discussion-based, you can take simple topics and have a critical spin on it and have a discussion of issues. And this enlightens students and make them think differently about themselves. Anything else you want to add, Kate?
For critical whiteness, I think I want you to, especially people who are white, has anybody ever asked you, are you white? Now, if you've never had that question asked, you are swimming in a sea of whiteness. If you've never had your race or ethnicity questioned, you are swimming in a sea of that. And the biggest thing that I could say, the difference is, if anybody has lived outside the country they were born in, and I have for 3 years. When you live outside the country you were born in and the dominant language and dominant culture is not yours, you understand how you have to do significant different layers. And that's what, if you want to start thinking about critical whiteness and thinking about how you are the dominant culture and everyone else has to thinks about your culture and how it relates to their culture, but you're not. That's why you bring out critical whiteness, so you can start thinking about that.
We all have 1 minute, sorry.
Oh, Okay.
Yes, Kate.
Okay, I'll speed through these two real quick. White racial epiphanies. We've been seeing a lot of these in the last year. Okay, where someone who's white going, oh my gosh, you mean you had to deal with, are you serious? You had to deal with that? Okay, that is a white racial epiphany, okay? We're suggesting that as instructional designers, being researchers in this field, you being educational technologists who train people, if you've ever had to train someone how to teach the difference between teaching face-to-face and online, think about that and now make it about race. Okay, if you never had to think about race when you were teaching or designing, try that metacognition of bringing in race, and also everything that Kristen will be bringing in when it comes to intersectionality. And sorry, we could talk forever, so I'll just leave it here.
Thank you. So yeah, I feel like after every presentation, I just want to say there's so much more to talk about for all of these. And so we really are presenting this webinar as the beginning of a conversation that we hope will continue in CLT meetings, in, you know, a conference, and papers and collaborations and all of that. So thank you. Thank you both. And Kristen is our last presenter.
Kristen needs to remember to unmute her. That's going to be, oof. Okay, I'll start my time, keep my time on me as well. Hi, I'm Kristen Herman. I'm a student in my second year of a doctoral program at Old Dominion University, and I'm going to be speaking today about intersectionality. So we've just heard 4 presentations back to back, 4 phenomenal presentations. I've really enjoyed this webinar, even though I knew about it and helped plan it. But mindful of where we'd be at this point, I thought I'd start with a little audience participation to kind of jazz it up a little bit here. So if you're able to, I invite you to turn your camera on. And I understand that we are recording and some of you might not be able to, but if you're able to turn your camera on, we're going to play a little game here, a little interactive session. I'm going to say a name. If it's a name you recognize, leave your camera on. If it's a name you do not recognize, turn your camera back off. So here we go. Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray. I'm just checking. It looks like most people who turned their cameras on at the beginning still have them on. So let's keep going. Michelle Cousseau, Tanisha Anderson, Megan Hockaday, Aura Rosser. All right. So full transparency, I did take this activity directly from a TED Talk given by Kimberly Crenshaw, which will be included on today's reading list. So I'm not trying to pass this off as my own activity, but it was very powerful when I saw her do it as a TED Talk in 2016. Very powerful still even today, 5 years later. Why is it that we as a society, we can remember the names of the young Black men who are disproportionately made victim of an inequitable system, but not the names of the young Black women? Intersectionality may provide some guidance for that. We've seen 4 other phenomenal presentations so far today on theories the field needs now. I've been so thankful to go last and have everyone kind of hype me up a little bit. Intersectionality is going to both support and ask for more from those theories, a very much a yes and moment. Individuals can be excluded from, say, feminist theory or anti-racist policy because both focus on a set of experiences that does not narrow enough to accurately reflect the intersection of race and gender. The intersectional experience is greater than the sum of just race and gender. That is to say, we can't just say, well, I considered Black learners, I considered female learners, thus I understand the lived experience of Black female learners. Any analysis that does not take intersectionality into account cannot sufficiently address the particular manner in which individuals are subordinated by an unequal system. I really like this image. It comes from Syracuse University. the way it suggests overlaps or intersections in various components that make up our identity. By contrast, and this is not shade, I did speak to Rebecca about this from a little bit ago. This image, where I won't mention where it's from unless someone calls me on copyright, and then I will share where it's from, but I don't want to share the image that I'm kind of berating here. It doesn't really speak to the same overlaps in an intersectional way. We are the sum components of our identities. And I think that was the point Rebecca was trying to make. But that doesn't mean that we're living in intersectionality at every moment. So I used to coach cross-country runners, and several issues we could talk about as a team, both genders together. Hydration, footwear, training cycles. For those conversations, gender didn't play into a factor. We were all runners, and that was really the only thing. We certainly still had our gender, but it existed in a completely separate sphere with no intersection. However, when we discussed trail safety with our athletes, we spent longer with our female runners about using your keys as a defense during an attack, carrying pepper spray on a run late at night. There are times when gender and a role of a runner do intersect in important and unfortunate ways. Two more points I want to make here, and I'll use another personal example to illustrate. Sometime before the pandemic began, I was in a Five Below store with my daughters. We approached the checkout counter with our items, and I mentioned to the cashier, like I usually do, "No bag, please." My 7-year-old asked why we weren't getting a bag. And so I saw a chance for education. We're all educators all the time. And I saw a chance for education. So I tried to explain in 7-year-old terms about the scourge of single-use plastic and the need to protect the environment for protecting her future. So we paid for our items and we stepped to the side and we started bagging them in my backpack as we usually do. And the next customers kind of approached the counter, another mother-daughter pair. And clearly the daughter had overheard the conversation because she kind of tugged on her mother's sleeve and she said, "Mom, we don't need a bag either, right?" And her mother replied with just as much passion as I had. She said, "No, you always get a bag. That way no one can accuse you of having stolen from the store." Two mothers, both trying to protect the future of our children. But in this lived experience, motherhood intersected with race. I am a white mother and she was a Black mother. Intersectionality demands that we acknowledge differences between, such as the differences between male runners and the differences between female runners, and differences among, such as how sustainability campaigns might appeal to multiple races of mothers in Southeastern Pennsylvania. And I shouldn't pretend that our experiences as those two types of mothers in Southeastern Pennsylvania speak for all the experiences of mothers in Southeastern Pennsylvania. Ignoring differences within groups contributes to tension among groups, while failing to address the complex needs of each individual. So, an approach grounded in intersectionality becomes a really large charge for us as designers. How do we design not only for multiple personalities within our populations, but for the multiple intersecting experiences of each individual within that population? I found a localized context of use approach allows for the consideration of intersecting aspects of learners throughout the design process. This is an approach that was originally developed by healthcare design, and I have some of those resources included in the reading list. It was realized how many different ways an EpiPen can be administered to individuals. So we couldn't, if we were charged as a group with writing a training on EpiPen use, there's not just a single narrative on EpiPen use because context matters. Is the user of the EpiPen in their own home? Are they in an elementary school? Are they in a hospital? Context goes beyond place and space and suggests different end users. Who is this training designed for? Is the user self-administering? Is it a family member? Is it a classroom teacher? So a localized context of use approach really takes the focus off of what the information is and places that focus on what the information does in a given circumstance. Another narrative. I'm currently working as an online and digital learning director in a K-12 district in Southeastern Pennsylvania. I have lived experience in this field. My previous school district was the first in the county to develop its own online pathway to a diploma. If I look at simply at only the local context, the time and space of my new district, I miss the intersectionality that exists within context itself. My previous district had the #1 test scores in the county. My current district is second to last in everything. So localized context is not just local context. It's not just environmental analysis. Considering the audience who will be using the design is critical to this approach. My previous district catered to a small subpopulation of all things, of pre-Olympian figure skaters who needed the flexibility of online learning to be training. My current district needs that flexibility as well, and that's why they're looking at online learning. But the flexibility is needed here because several of our high school students have to supplement family income. So family have enough food to eat so that there's enough to pay rent. To consider only Generation Z learners, or to consider only what it means to be from where Mayor of Aston is, if that even means anything, that wouldn't be enough. It would ignore the socioeconomic intersection of our learners for my specific population. And one of the things I think everyone has talked about today that I've really enjoyed is that we would be remiss to discuss any of these theories without considering intersectionality of ourselves as designers. So how do our overlaps contribute to bias? We've discussed how intersectionality requires us to acknowledge difference between and difference among. To that end, we cannot assume that our lived experience is generalizable. I know I'm running short on time, so if you do decide to kind of come to a breakout room, I do have a kind of conceptual framework that I can put this all into here. I do want to kind of leave with this final question, which comes from Isabel Wilkerson's book. The central question about human behavior is not why do people do this? Why do they act this way? It's not so much about what the information is, but what is it that human beings do when faced with a given circumstance? So 3 kind of key components to leave us with: reflect, design, and then act. If we never take action and never leave the design cycle, we're never going to get anywhere in the world. All right, that's my time.
Perfect. Thank you, Kristen. You can see why we had intersectionality presented last. Kind of pulls everything together.